Welcome to The Authority File, a podcast by Choice. My name is Bill Mickey. I'm the editorial director here at Choice. And this week we're continuing our series of episodes that take a look back at some of our favorite clips from the many conversations we've had since debuting The Authority File last summer. Since then, we've recorded about 23 episodes, all of which, as usual, are available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or right off choice360.org. So if any of these highlight clips are from episodes you haven't listened to yet, and you'd like to hear the full series or conversation, feel free to go back and tune into the full episode. Our second round of highlight clips comes from our second series, which is a conversation we had with Bobbi Newman and Tijerina, who are the editors of the book Protecting Patron Privacy, a Leader Guide. In this first clip, we learn about what librarians think of when they put digital privacy in the library context. Part of the process of writing this book was to define privacy, which helped Bonnie and Bobbi determine the role a library plays in protecting it for patrons. Here's Bonnie to say more about that.
Yeah, I think really broadly, when I think of privacy, I see it as being defined as sort of the ability for an individual or a group of people to express themselves selectively or to seclude themselves if they want to, or some information about themselves. So when we think about privacy, it's not just, oh, there's data collected about me from, say, some website, and so therefore I'm not private online. Like, it's not that simple. I think when you think about it really simply, I understand the argument people make, well, privacy is dead or privacy doesn't matter. But to me, what privacy really is about that ability of the individual or group of people to be empowered enough to say, I'm okay with this information being, I'm okay with providing this information about me because I understand how it's going to be used, what the trade-offs are, and what I'm getting for that. And I understand that. And that's a very kind of empowering way to think of privacy. It's making these choices. But what is actually the case is that in a lot of cases, we don't know what's being collected about us. We don't know how it's being used. And we don't know what future uses may be used with this information. And then what all that collection then might say about me as an individual, might say about my community, other people like me. And so it's that part where we don't really have the ability to make the informed decision that I think is sort of the issue right now online. There's, in terms of the broad landscape, there's obviously, invasion of privacy can happen from the government. We saw a lot of that sort of post-Snowden. And sort of what that revealed. There's obviously data being collected about us by corporations. We know that not only in America, but in the world, that people, privacy is obviously something that's important to people. Many countries have privacy laws, and in some countries, it's part of their constitution. So almost every country, in some way, limits or allows individuals their right to privacy. So while culturally we may want to keep, what we think of as wanting, what we want to keep private, what we're okay with sharing, that may change culturally or during different periods of time. But the definition of privacy, in my mind, I think remains the same. So for what that means for libraries specifically, I think libraries. There's just, again, the history of libraries wanting the library to be the place where people can, learn whatever they want to learn and be able to do that without worrying about someone watching over them, without worrying about discrimination or sort of being put in a box because they're looking at that type of information. So it makes sense in my mind with libraries. But what the current issues are that first of all, we before it was simply we got rid of records for books that people checked out, but now we're actually a gateway providing access to a lot more information. A lot of that information is electronic, and we send people off to other places. So, one area that libraries need to think about and consider is, what is our role in informing our users when we are sending them off to other places? It's not our content in our buildings anymore. And what's our role there? So there's sort of thinking about it that way, but there's also thinking about, on the national stage, what do libraries, what are we advocating for in terms of laws and regulations, whether it's government surveillance or what we allow companies to collect about us and that kind of thing.
Okay, so that was sort of the library perspective on what privacy means to the institution and how they're sort of charged with protecting it for patrons. And in this next clip, we're going to talk a little bit about the patron or consumer attitude toward privacy and what Bonnie and Bobbi have seen in that regard. And I suspect if you were to sort of generalize about it, you would think most folks think privacy is pretty much dead at this point. With all the information we need to enter into various fields to, sign up for certain things online or, buying things, subscribing to things, and just the footprints we leave just browsing around the web in general. Privacy might be a sort of foregone conclusion. But, what I think Bobbi and Bonnie are also seeing is that people still do care about privacy online and in the digital arena. They just don't feel like they're able to do anything about it, which of course opens up an opportunity for librarians. So here's a little bit more about what Bonnie and Bobbi have to say about that. If you were to ask a variety of folks about their attitudes and expectations around online privacy, there might be a variety of responses. One assumption is, I guess, if you ask most people, they'd want their data kept private and don't want to be surreptitiously monitored. Yet it seems like most folks might know what's going on anyway and might be resigned to that. Is that a fair assessment, or have you experienced something different?
Well, no, I think that's sort of a fair assessment, but I think the important thing is that I would say that most people, even the ones that think they know what's going on with their data, don't actually know that. Right. We've seen some studies, Pew does some great work, but the questions they actually asked for their privacy study weren't the best research questions. And if you dig into that, it sort of explains the responses you saw. But, this analogy gets used a lot when we talk about privacy, and that's the fact that people close their curtains or drapes at night, or during the day as well, to keep people from seeing in. Now, 99.9% of the people doing that aren't hiding anything nefarious. They're just, watching TV, but when it's night out, you can see in and they can't see out. And I think one of the problems that we have with privacy online in our country is that we can't see out to know who's watching us and if they're recording us and what they're doing with that later. And I think if it were as simple as closing your drapes, as if ensuring your privacy online and your data online were kept private, were as easy as just closing your drapes, probably everyone would do it, Mm-hmm. The problem is that it's not, and it's not because technology is complicated, because what's driven technological advances in the U.S. especially is capitalism and the desire to profit off those things. You look at Facebook, which is free, but obviously they make a lot of money right. from the data that they're collecting. So, this book was written post Snowden, but pre the most recent election. And I think we saw a lot of shift after Snowden, and I think we've seen more of that since the election and with what's happening in the current administration. Bonnie may know some more specifics.
Well, I also think, so I agree with Bobbi. I think that there definitely are people who feel like, even Mark Zuckerberg said privacy is dead. He said that a few years ago. There's this idea that no one cares about it, but what we do actually see from studies is that people do care, but they're often feeling pretty overwhelmed or disempowered to do anything about it. You don't want to not use Facebook if that's the place you're primarily connecting with old friends and family, but they're not necessarily wanting to not share information about themselves, but they also don't necessarily know how to protect themselves more online. And I think as tools are getting easier and are not just for the sort of technologically more savvy or elite folks, as these sort of more privacy focused tools and technologies become available, I think we'll see more people using them. So I think attitudes definitely changed after we saw how much information was collected about us. But I think as we can make privacy an easier thing to get, then I think we'll see attitudes, I think, adjust again.
Yeah. All right. So that's sort of the patron attitude towards privacy. And next, I asked Bonnie and Bobbi what they thought about what the patron's responsibility is in regard to their own privacy needs when they're online and in the library using digital services. Because there's so many choices that individuals make when they're spending their time online or using digital resources that perhaps they should be in command of some of the things that they're doing themselves. But Bonnie and Bobbi, are more of the thought that they can't be solely responsible for their own privacy. And they discuss a little bit the kinds of decisions libraries need to make with regard to keeping internal data generated by patron use of library tools and digital services, private, and perhaps helping or assisting patrons understand, what they're getting into with regard to privacy. And again, here's Bonnie and Bobbi to explain that further.
I don't think it's appropriate to put the responsibility back on the patron at this point in the privacy technology situation. If protecting your own privacy was as easy as closing your drapes, then yeah, I think that probably, okay, maybe I'd buy into that. But I think that given the history of libraries and the dedication to privacy that we've seen and our role in technology and digital literacy, that we obviously have more resources and a better understanding of a lot of these things than the average patron. And some of that is just basic. Some of the things that we can do are just so basic. For example, having data tracking on our services be opt-in instead of opt-out. Have the default be that they have to agree to collect that data, versus that the vendors are automatically have access to it. And that was something we went back and forth on in this committee that we've talked about. I think the other thing is that patrons and libraries, there's different reasons to collect different data, right? So obviously we have to keep track of who has a book while it's checked out. But after it's been returned, we don't have any reason to keep track of which individual had that book out. We don't have a good reason. And there are probably people who would argue that with me, and I don't care. But patrons sometimes want to keep track of what they checked out, right? We know anybody who's worked in a public library or even an academic library knows they'll come back and I'm like, oh, I read this book and it had a blue cover and there's a teapot on it. Like, I cannot remember what it was. And so some of the new options that we have in our new systems allow patrons to opt in to track their reading history. For that reason, because they want to keep track, whether they want to just keep track of how many books they read this year, if they want to go back and try to remember what that book was so they can recommend it to a friend. they have all kinds of reasons for opting into that. But I can almost guarantee you that no one is opting into that for the sole purpose to allow a vendor to collect data on them. Mm-hmm. But that's what happens when they do that, right? And so, when we talk about this, and one of I think our role is to try to work to make sure that we're ensuring the privacy of our patrons, and then the decisions they make don't get used against them, either in a nefarious way or in a way that, say, maybe they wouldn't approve of. Nobody reads those fine print terms, right? I mean, yeah. Like every time I update my iPhone, I'm like, whatever, click,
I do the same thing.
And that's another part of the problem, that it's so complicated and there's so much legalese, and that they can't just say, we're going to use this data to track you and we're going to try to sell you products.
Some of the technology that you're talking about has created opportunities that libraries can use to enhance their own services, but in some ways might undercut their ability to uphold their promise to protect patron privacy. I mean, it's just, where a library might opt to, use this technology to keep track of, the various ways patrons are engaging with library services. Is that data perhaps something that just stays, obviously stays internal, or do libraries need to make decisions on even that kind of approach to data?
So to answer your question, I do think that libraries need to be asking themselves a lot of questions when they're working with vendors and when they're using tools that are not kept in-house. And so Bobbi had mentioned earlier about a project that I'm working on, a grant-funded project through IMLS with Michael Zimmer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we're specifically looking at this issue. So we are in this catch-22 kind of space where there's tools available externally. There's also a number of libraries working on in-house tools that are not necessarily relying on outside vendors. Those are, of course, bigger libraries or libraries that have the budget to be able to actually construct things in-house. Mm-hmm. But what we want to do is what we feel like, at least at this moment, that there isn't a good understanding by decision makers and leaders in our profession to fully kind of think through all the questions that we may want to be asking of these vendors or even of these in-house tools that we're bringing, especially in terms of privacy, but even beyond that, just sort of how we sort of bake in our values either in the tools we build or in the questions we ask when we're negotiating with third parties. So one of the outputs of our project is to actually create these sort of field guides to help decision makers. Let's say, for instance, if they're talking with a cloud computing organization or a digital content vendor, and they're trying to decide, whether to go with them or not, to sort of help them with specific questions. Because I do think there's sort of a set of audits or questions that could be asked to determine if a vendor is how they're holding on to data, or if the tool's being built internally, what is the security around certain data? How long do you actually need, what are you actually going to use it for, and how long do you actually need to keep it, if you need to keep it at all? I think being able to ask a series of questions can help an organization decide if they do want to work with third party, or they do want to build a tool internally to help them utilize data.
Okay, so those previous clips may have raised some questions. And this next clip, I hope, will answer some of those, and that has to do with how libraries can actually implement specific policies around privacy programs and execute on their own initiatives. And to help walk us through that, once again, here is Bonnie.
Well, so in one of our chapters, the chapter on one of the case studies at the City University of New York, they talk about privacy audit that they were in the process of implementing. And I think, that they were sort of looking at it from several different levels. They were looking at it from everywhere from the level of permission and access for staff to a range of patron staff records. So just sort of taking a look at what are our levels of permission. Do everyone that has certain levels of permission, do they need to? Looking at time frames for deletion of specific patron and staff records. So how long do we need to keep things? Looking at technology in terms of the encryption of patron data, looking at protocols for notifying patrons if their records are going to be looked at, having things set up like daily purges, limiting access to certain personnel to see certain information, even to training, so reminding staff, informing them to log off, especially if they're using systems that have patron-related information, logging off when they walk away. So there's in the book we do talk specifically about the sort of this example of the auditing that happened there. Bill Martin from NYPL also talks a bit about sort of looking at how to collect, or how to classify the different types of data that are coming into the library, and thinking about them in terms of how serious it would be if any of that information got out. Sort of like prioritizing the risk level for different types of data. So, I think the book kind of touches on a few chapters about how a library can sort of start to audit themselves and think about internal to their organization, how they're handling data from the communication perspective, from the technological perspective, the cybersecurity perspective, and also in terms of practices and protocols.
Okay, that does it for this second episode of Retrospective Clips. And next week we'll continue with our look back at some of our favorite conversations and visit with an author who writes about famous historical documents and objects from the perspective of an information scientist. And as always, if you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. And be sure to leave us a rating and review. It does help others discover the Authority File podcast, and it lets us know how we're actually doing. We'd also love to hear from you. You can leave feedback on Twitter with the handle @choice_reviews. And thanks again for joining us.